The world is waking up, and you finding your way here today is no coincidence. The spirit world always has a way of guiding us where we most need to be at the absolute perfect time. I'm your host, Lindsay Morlock, and you're listening to the Guided Podcast, where we explore how the spirit world works on our behalf to guide us along our paths. This is where you'll learn how to live a life that is both conscious and connected, so you can supercharge your pathway to healing and open to life's magic and miracles. Come along this journey to see how guided you truly are. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Guided. This week, I am so excited to introduce you to Lisa McCrohan. Lisa is an integrative coach, somatic experiencing psychotherapist, author, and poet. She works with clients all over the world to follow what delights their hearts and lead a life they deeply love at home and in business. She is the author of 2 books, Gems of Delight and Your Light is Rising. She is the producer and host of a podcast called Delightful, where science and psychology meet spirituality and creativity. She has over 25 years of experience in guiding organizations and individuals through an integrative approach to healing, working, and living. Lisa lives in Middletown, Maryland, with her husband, 2 children, and their dog Sherlock, with the mountains outside their back door. So Lisa, thank you so much for being here. I am so excited to dive into these topics with you today.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here with you, Lindsay. Thank you.
Yay. So the way I always like to start out these conversations with people is really diving into your awakening story. So I would love for you to share with the audience, in whatever way feels good to you, how your personal journey with spirit and your own intuitive gifts have opened and awakened throughout your life.
I love that question. So it's interesting because sometimes I feel like, I don't have a breakthrough story. I don't have like this thing of like, I wasn't spiritual and then now I am, and these really large stories. And so I used to think sometimes like, I don't really have a story, but actually I do. I have this story of just feeling that I was connected even when I was little. So I thought I'd share a few little things about that. So I can remember when I was 6 years old and it was a fall crisp day. I was getting ready for school, like had my little Catholic school uniform on, my backpack, and I was waiting for my mom and my siblings in the house, and I was outside in the driveway. It was just me by myself, and I literally remember, like I can feel this in my body right now as we're talking, like breathing in the fall crisp air. And I felt this connection to something bigger than me. And yet I was a part of. Now, I didn't have the language back then. And I just kind of, when we're so little, right, we just accept that. We just kind of like, oh yeah. And this is, there wasn't this cognitive thing with it. It was just, I was just a part of things. And this piece was just in me. It was just in me. So, and I have moments like that where I can look back and see those things that I've been doing this same kind of just listening within and trying to honor what I hear. Like even in 3rd grade, Mrs. Costenbader's 3rd grade class, we were writing books. We were, you'd take cardboard and then you'd put contact paper over it to make covers, and then you'd string things in between. And we wrote books. And even back, and everybody could check out the book in your class, like the library, check it out. And even back then, I was writing and illustrating in quotes, because that's what 3rd grader does. I was writing about delight, compassion, and connection to one another, to our hearts. And I wouldn't have used the word spirit back then, but I was writing about that. So, and even in, fast forward to college, and I was majoring in business, which people are often surprised with, like, oh wait, you majored in business undergrad? My college friends would be like, oh yeah, of course. But people who know me now, like, wow, you majored in business, but always with this bent of looking at and exploring social justice and deep healing. So I worked at medical-free clinics, and then even after college, worked at medical-free clinics and things. I lived and worked in Guatemala and El Salvador, and then that even deepened my sense of connection to the divine and how, I learned. And then over the years, I learned yoga and Reiki. I studied in grad school, theology and also clinical social work, but with an emphasis on theology of the body. And so, and then the trauma work, being a psychotherapist. And so it's always been about how spirituality is just weaved into who we are. And so, and it's not always that I've listened perfectly at all. There's lots of times where I'm like, I trust, I drop into that. And then I resist, and then I resist and think I'm going to do it all on my own. And so, yeah, those kinds of things. And I think the most recently, I'm 49 now, but in my 30s, I heard God. So I use that language a lot, like heard. It's like coming from within me, the sense of, and it's such a Capricorn thing. It was the perfect message, like God saying to me, or the divine saying to me, spirit saying to me, like, Lisa, you do not need to go out and make things happen. I will literally bring it to your doorstep. So we've been in a dance, a tango with that for a good 10, 15, 20 years, pushing against that and everything else, and then allowing that. And so I think that my journey has been one of feeling God or the divine to alongside me and moving through me, speaking through me in my poetry, and then the challenges of that too, and the struggles of that, but over time. And then most recently, just the last maybe 15 years, again, I just heard the divine saying to me, like, you are a modern day mystical poet. So be that poet and be that delight. And so we'll get into more things and how that challenges me and all those things. But yeah, so that listening within and trying to honor what I hear.
There's so many great nuggets that I just want to dive into all of these individual little things with you, because one, the immediate thing that catches my attention is as you talk about your awakening and you talk about these moments of listening within, whether it was in your childhood or whether even now, you really talk about it from this perspective. And even with theology, this felt sense, like theology of the body, and knowing some of the work that you do with somatic experiencing. And for anyone who doesn't know, that's a form of trauma work. And it's about really feeling into the body and building a sense of resilience within to be able to process things that may have felt too hard or too painful to be with, right?
Yeah.
So I love that you talk about this connection with the divine as this felt sense, because I agree with you. It is a felt sense. Our intuition is of the body. And I think so many times when people are going to, some sort of psychic or intuitive reader, they're thinking, and sure, we have different clairvoyance, different clairs that we capitalize on, but everybody has access to this felt sense within the body.
Yes. And some people might call it intuition but it's an embodied sense of knowing. And it's different than the other voices in us. It's like, we just know it. It's, right now as we're doing this, it's like, it's deeper. It's like my hands are, it's deeper than just the ego's voice, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the piece that part of this podcast is aimed at, right? How do we help people to connect with that part of themselves? And I'm curious, I'm diving deep right away with you.
Go for it. I love it.
But, I can't help but go into the somatic experiencing work on some level, because when you've experienced any kind of trauma, you are often disconnected from that part of yourself because that felt sense of the intuitive place, right? Because the ego has gone on in protection, and it makes perfect sense that people, right, would feel highly protective, and that emotion or that trauma is running interference with our intuition. And so how do you help people, find their way back to that intuitive place and that place of feeling safe and to trust themselves in that intuition when there's so much stuff, whether it's big T or little t trauma, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, that's, I love it. That's what my work as an SE, or somatic experiencing practitioner and therapist, is about. So I'm going to bring up this word titrated. So I titrate things, and titrate means we do little bits. Like if a nurse is going to give you some medicine or a doctor's going to give you medicine, it's like a little bit at a time so you can get used to it. So just like if something overwhelmed us, whether when we were growing up or it's even something as an adult, and it was too much. So often what we describe trauma as is something too much, too fast, or too soon in our life. It's all the twos, So if it overwhelmed the system, and what I mean by system, nervous system, your whole system, every system in you, if it overwhelmed us in the moment, if it was too much for us in a moment, then going in and like going right for it and like, okay, like we're going to come right into your body. Like there was it's dangerous and will overwhelm the system again. You said a key word when you're describing somatic experiencing that was about resiliency, building resiliency in our nervous system. So building capacity to be able to be with a little bit of discomfort. And then that kind of, that builds up that muscle within us to be able to, I can work with what's arising in me. And it's a little bit safe to come back into my body with my fingers, like just my fingertips, for example, or just the soles of my feet. I can feel that. And that's safe for me. So like working out in the gym and you are trying to build up your biceps, you don't go and lift like 50 pounds each for in 10 reps of that. Like that's going to be too much. It's going to overwhelm your system, your muscular system. Well, going in and just working with everything, and now we're going to be fully embodied can be too much, because again, our brains and our systems are so intelligent that like, we're going to this is too much. So I'm going to take you away to preserve your life and to keep you alive. I'm going to take you out a little bit. I'm going to disembody you. Like that's what the system does. So my job is about safely and slowly building that capacity to be embodied in a titrated way, in a slow way that again builds that sense of resiliency and this ability to be with the discomfort sometimes of being embodied and working with our pain and suffering, and also the discomfort of feeling pleasure, of feeling alive, because sometimes that's triggering for people. And so being able to take in a little bit at a time until it's like this, things are flowing again and they're cleared out, but it's a slow, gradual, gentle, yet moving process and journey.
Yeah. And I love that you're bringing up this point around pleasure and delight, because I was just telling someone the other day that, the greater capacity we have to be with our pain also expands our capacity to be with our joy. And we don't always think of it that way, right? Like I think we have a culture that encourages people to marinate in their pain and their suffering, to wear it like a badge of honor and as some sort of method of moving forward. And we don't have to suffer like that. That is a choice, right? And we don't always have the conscious awareness. So I don't mean that from a judgmental perspective.
Yes.
But I want to talk about moving to this place of joy and pleasure and delight, because so much of the healing journey, I think the attention that it gets is all about, getting into the mud and going into the thick of it and leaning into the pain and really like sitting in it. And that is not fun. Number one, it's not necessary. And I think what we're ultimately trying to get to is the happiness. Like that's what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve something different than what the pain has created. And one of the things that you just exude every time I connect with you is just pure delight. Like I love that that's your podcast title, because it's so who you are, right? From my perception of you. I know we don't know each other all that well, but it's just my perception. Like there's just this delight that comes off of you. And it's like, how do you get there? And like, what is it like to be in that? Because I know that there is a certain level of capacity of needing to be with the hard stuff as an expander for the good stuff.
You say that so beautifully. It's interesting because again, just hearing, I'm taking in what you just said, that when you encounter me, read something, or we talk, or through our mutual friend and stuff too, it's like that I exude delight. Recently, a client said to me, I've worked with her for a couple of years, and she just said, I can't remember exactly how she said it, but she's like, that you just embody and exude delight. And it was so good to hear that back, I guess, too. So I'm just taking that in. So thank you. So yeah, okay. You are right on that. Let me share this from like a somatic experiencing perspective, because I think this could be really helpful to your listeners. So in SE, we say that there's a trauma vortex, right? That there's a vortex, and we want to learn to, I mean, it can easily suck us in big time. Our stress, toxic stress, our traumas, big T, little t, they can suck us in. Our attention can get very myopic. We can really get overwhelmed by that. And so we are developing and building the capacity to be with the deepening levels of discomfort of that trauma vortex. Now, also, what I love about SE and my approach of then bringing spirituality into all of that is that there's a counter vortex. So SE calls it a counter vortex. You could call it the healing vortex. We also need to build our capacity to be with feeling safe, feeling settled, feeling that sense of joy or delight. And so much of my work is about building both of those capacities to be able to take in delight, to be able to notice, for example, like just even right here, if I look across where in my office, my dog Sherlock is asleep on the couch and he's got his little paw over his nose, and it's just so cute. And if I take that in for a moment and savor that, as like Rick Hansen talks about, like savoring the good and building this capacity to feel that in my body, that delight of just watching Sherlock just hang out while I'm recording, just so chill. Like, oh, I feel that across my chest, my shoulders drop down and back, my breathing becomes smoother. And so taking in little moments of delight and joy. I mean, my word is delight, but it's about peace, awe, connection. These embodied moments or micro delights builds this capacity to then, like you say, to then exude that as well, to be that, to really be that. And we're not talking about this, what's the word, Lindsay, where it's like toxic positivity and that ignores the negative and that ignores the traumas. No, we aren't spiritual bypassing here. I honestly say, you ask like how I exude that, how did that come about? I've had a lot of pain in my life too. There's been a lot of hurts, and it's through the pain and through the being with. And then alongside that comes, if we allow it, a sense of delight, that sense of being connected to spirit, to other people, to our own bodies and hearts. And so really there's both of them happening. And I think that sometimes, there can be this like spiritual bypassing or this toxic positivity that ignores the challenges. And then there's also like what you talked about, this we're just in, in the hard work of it, and we got to stay. And there's this balance of both, because they really are about supporting one another. The capacity of joy supports being with the challenging times, and having the capacity to be with challenging or traumatic times builds capacity for taking in the good or the delightful or the joy.
It's so interesting, because what I hear you saying too is it feels like building this internal resourcing and almost using things like joy and pleasure and delight as a form of internal support to get through and to be with the pain, which we don't always talk about. And Spirit's like flashing me almost full circle to where you started this conversation, where as a child, right, writing these little books with, about compassion, about some of these things. And so it's interesting that, because we do come into this world innately connected to this internal resourcing, with compassion and love, and right, some of these feel good, not some, but a lot of feel good emotions. And then we disconnect from them as we move along our journeys, and as we're maybe hardened a bit or calloused by the things that happen in our lives. And I love that you're kind of bringing this back to, connecting in with these little moments of joy or these little moments of delight, because it doesn't have to be this grandiose thing. Because I think a lot of people who are in pain struggle to identify even a moment of pleasure, or they feel like they have to remember this time in their life when they were so happy or so joyful. And it's so hard to connect to that when you're very far away from that particular frequency, right?
100%. And so when I work with people in coaching and integrative coaching and psychotherapy, there is this like assessment of what capacity somebody has to be safe and settled in an embodied way, and to be able to take in a little bit of joy. Like even just right now, we're recording and it's spring, and so I'm looking at the cherry blossom that's behind us. We have a weeping willow cherry tree, which is so beautiful, and these pink blossoms, and being able to take that in for a moment in the body and noticing how that goodness, that expansion spreads and organically and no force, very gently, and then building that. Like, so then maybe again, those micro delights, those micro moments of feeling that soft hum of aliveness. Like that's one definition or one way I like to describe delight. Like it's just this soft hum of aliveness within us. It's noticing a sunset. It's petting your dog. It's receiving a hug. It's tasting something that just is so good, like your favorite meal, and enjoying that with a friend and savoring that for just 5 seconds and then 10 and 30 seconds. That really buffers us for difficult experiences. And even more so, we need those moments when we are in pain, when we are going through something hard and challenging and uncertain. We need those glimmers of those moments because it brings us hope. It reminds us that something is bigger than our pain, and that our pain is actually being held by something bigger, the divine spirit. It's like, and we're still connected to life. There's still life to be had.
Yeah. And I think you're speaking to themes around using delight and joy as even a presence process, right? Something that is totally grounding you in the moment, like just be here now in this moment with this noticing of whatever is going on, whether it's watching that sunset or whether it's petting your dog, right? It's just being very mindful and very in the moment. And I think that is, regardless of trauma, that's so many of our problems, right? We're either ruminating about the past, we're stressing out about the future, right? So the depression, anxiety spectrum, right? And using the concept of delight as a presence process. I think a lot of times people talk about a gratitude practice, or they talk about, which is a similar theme, right? Another way of maybe achieving the same result. But I love the thought of using delight as that intentional presence process.
Oh, 100%. Because, okay, so trauma and little t, big T, and toxic stress, it takes us out of the present moment. It takes us out of our bodies. And so learning that I'm putting my hands on my heart right now as we're talking. It's like, oh, I can come back into my body and it can be safe and soothing. And so that I can, this restrict or this constriction and restriction in us can lighten a little, is such a nourishing thing for our nervous systems right now in today's age of constant pings and dings and chronic stress, just constantly, like, of soothing our nervous systems and then opening to flow, like flow with a capital F. And spirit. It's like, oh, because that's when we're receiving that guidance, those intuitive whispers and shouts sometimes. And it's like we're receiving that. And that's how spirit speaks to us in this present moment.
100%. And I think it's so, when I see, especially now I'm kind of flashing to your Instagram posts, and because all of your poetry, every time I read something that you put out there, it just feels completely channeled. Like you can tell that there is something moving through you with these words because you can feel the truth to them. And yet you strike a chord that is so profound you pack a punch like in such a profound way with your poetry. And I love that you have, you grew up Catholic, but you have found your way to this more all-encompassing divine source essence, however you want to qualify it. And so, how are you, allowing spirit and your intuition to kind of guide you through your life and in the creativity that you put out into the world, your work, all of the things?
Oh my goodness. Okay. So, I mean, even just right there, taking a breath, feeling my feet on the earth, feeling the integrity of my spine and sitting in that, like Buddha talked about, like your noble nature. It's just, I mean, the part of all of us just is, we have this posture of nobility and the crown of the head reaching up to the sky so that I can be a vessel. So I can be a vessel. And through the breath, through, again, that body awareness, and then the cognitive thing of like, okay, source, I'm really fighting up against this and I surrender. So it's that, and it's really actually in my life as a midlife woman now, I am not trying to get rid of anything, like any part of myself. I call it, my approach is radical inclusion, that everything is included now with boundaries. So this sense of that everything is sacred, every part of us is sacred. And so that word, and it's one of my favorite 3-letter words. I talk to my clients about that all the time, of like, this can be here and this. So I can be afraid, I can be nervous, I can be jealous, I can be ashamed, I can be all the things, and I can be struggling, and I can have this prayer, this intention of help me to surrender, like help me to open to something bigger than what my ego or whatever you want to call it is interfering with and trying to quote unquote keep me safe. And so both can be here. And I struggle I don't know if I can swear. I can struggle a heck of a lot less because of that. And so when you ask about how I channel or how I work with spirit, it's that sense of I can bring all of me, my human self, all that makes me human and messy and totally imperfect, and all the things I brought into this life or collected from the collective conscious, it can all be here. And I can drop into the sense of surrender and trust that source has got me, that spirit has got me, and can work with whatever I bring: shame, guilt, jealousy, anxiety, all the things, because I tend to run a little bit anxious. That's just my thing. And so a long time ago, I just stopped trying to get rid of my anxiety and just said, okay, so anxiety's here. And there's that word again. And I can still practice presence. I can still show up. I can still put my prayers out to the universe, that the universe will guide me and be alongside me. So yeah, I just struggle a lot less, that it takes a lot less energy. It's really lovely. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I think we're such a dualistic world where, and I fall into this as well. It's funny because I was driving home after a recent spiritual retreat, and I saw 3 skunks on the way home, and I was like, what is the message here? Right. And so someone pointed out to me the whole skunk, black and white, being very black and white in my thinking. And that really caught me with what you're saying, because I do think we have this tendency. It's like, you cannot be both grieving and excited, or you can't be, right? It's like we force people to fit into this box or that box. And you're right. It's not an either or, it's an and. And when we can appreciate all of those parts of ourselves, all of those aspects, and welcome all of the things, the messages that all of the emotions are trying to share with us, it is much easier to move through it. I think because and I think this was so much, I always think of Peter Levine's quote around trauma, which is, that trauma occurs, is not the result of the event itself, but lack of an empathetic witness. And I think what you're talking about is, how do we witness ourselves? How do we witness every single emotion that is coming up for us in any given moment, and really validate that for ourselves? Because there's real power in being able to acknowledge what we are going through. through.
You always have such a lovely way with words, and you say things so clearly and so succinctly. I'm an external processor, and I'm always just so grateful for the way that you say things and put things into words. So thank you for that. Yeah, that validation. Oh my goodness. It is something that could easily be looked over and jumped over. And in the healing process, it's like, and that witness, that loving, compassionate witness. So I often talk to my clients about how this is from like Tara Brach and Jack Kornfield, that there are two wings to awareness: mindfulness and compassion. And so like, it's like a bird, my clients, just the other day, someone sketched out a butterfly, and her butterfly was awareness. And then there's the wing of compassion, and there's the wing of mindfulness. And we want awareness to be present. That's what we're talking about, that witness, at embodied awareness. And that then supports us being able to use mindfulness to notice what's here, and then to bring in compassion. And that's where that validation comes from. Comes in. So that sense of, oh, like, I'm hurting right now. I mean, even as I say that, I'm putting my hands on my heart. And so I'm noticing in those moments, like, oh, I'm hurting right now. The noticing is that mindfulness, and that aware one is online, that loving witness, as well as then applying compassion. And that does such wonders, that validating of our own selves and holding space for ourselves in that embodied way is, I think, the very first step in any kind of healing, and learning to be able to do that so that we can work with the different emotions that show up and not get overwhelmed by them. But as you said so beautifully, feeling into the gift that even a difficult emotion is offering us. And then when we do that, the emotion comes in and it's showing us its stuff. It's offering us its gift and challenge. And then when it has delivered its gift and we've worked with it in this embodied way, this aware way of using mindfulness and compassion, then it recedes into the background until we need it again. And so that's why everything is included, again, in a titrated or a boundaried way with the embodied aware one, quote unquote, online.
Yeah. And one thing I actually learned from you was when I was working in my corporate job, actually, and we had you come, share your expertise with our organization. And one of the things that I still to this day use, you talked about how the nervous system really responds to what we're saying. It really hears us. And at the time you had said, put your hand on your heart and just say, like, this is hard. This is really hard right now. Or, so I use that one all the time in the moment. Like, I feel that helps me to really help my heart feel acknowledged, right? Like, this is really hard right now. And the other thing that you taught me was this concept of just soften, like putting my hand on my heart, taking a breath, and just because I can literally feel when the armor comes up around my heart, right? If I'm feeling defensive, if I'm upset, if I'm triggered, I can literally feel those walls come up. And it's amazing that just taking a moment to take a breath, I always feel like, spirit's coming in with that breath, but you are putting your hand on your heart, really connecting to that intention, and then just soften. Like, it's okay to soften. It's okay to surrender, be in the moment, and just drop the defenses. And there is something very nurturing, I feel, about being able to just in the moment when you don't necessarily have access, especially if you're in fight or flight or having some sort of response in that way. Sometimes that's all we can access is one word.
Oh, yes. And I love having those kinds of things that we can quickly access, because in those moments of stress and those moments of when we're in that stress mode of fight, flight, fawn, all the F's, that just one word can help us come into presence so that we aren't disconnected from the other parts of us that can help us in any situation. Yeah. So that then when we bringing in that word soften, I mean, that was my word for the year, a couple years in a row, because I need a lot of softening. So now I embody that, but it took a couple years of intention and things. So we bring in that word soften in the moment when our defenses go up, just enough to be able to bring that aware one back online. brain so that then you can have access to the frontal cortex of your brain to be like, okay, now let me get curious about these defenses, because the defenses are up for different reasons, like habit. And also, again, it's always to protect us. And it's like, oh, is this a situation where the defense is coming up and that I need to interrupt that pattern, or I need to listen to that pattern? And so but we can't do that when we're caught up in that fight or flight, when we're so caught up in it that it's overwhelmed the system. So that sense of, oh, let me kind of come into some embodied presence and soften, like, hang on a second, honey, hang on a second. I'll say to myself, like, oh, I put my hands on my heart. And that's a protective thing. It creates a barrier, right? It's like, oh, hang on a second. I am protecting my heart. I'm putting my hand here. I'm offering some containment, as we say in SE. And so to allow for an opportunity for me to come into my body, settle into the breath, as you talked about, to feel that breath moving through us, so that then I can see myself, soothe myself, and then get curious about the next right thing to do, to interrupt that pattern in something in a particular way. Like, oh, wait, I don't need the defenses to go up here now with my partner. This has been this habitual thing. I'm going to try something new. Or any other pattern of when our defenses come up, like, oh, maybe I want to try something new. But we can't get curious when we are so armored and in that stress mode.
Yeah. And I think you're highlighting an important point, which is this like immediate need to care for the self, right? We need to address the immediate reaction, breathing, releasing the emotion, right? Dealing with that, and then allowing ourselves to come back into a place where we're receptive for whatever guidance that we might need to hear, whether there's a step we need to take or whether we need to just let something go and let God, or right, whatever it might be.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah. But we can come back to that place of balance and alignment much faster if we take the time to lean into it. And I think so many of us, myself included, are so trained and conditioned to move away from it, or to go the way we move away from it. I think the most often is just we go into our minds and start overanalyzing the whole thing, right?
Oh, of course. Of course. I mean, we live in a culture that supports that and promotes that too. So even more so practicing like everything that you're about, which is this tuning in and coming into the breath, the awareness of the breath. I mean, that is, oh gosh, we can spend our lives just honoring the breath and connecting to the breath and deepening that relationship, which you so facilitate. And so that then, like you say that so beautifully, so then we can receive the guidance that we need.
I think that was one of the things that I found so powerful about my own SE sessions was it really helped you, especially for people who are so in their minds. It was a great way of learning how to just feel into the body and not think about your emotion, but quite literally you're locating sensation in the body. Like, oh, there's something that feels a little constricted in the throat here. Oh, wow. Now as I feel the throat, now I'm just like noticing some tension or tightness in my shoulders. And right, like anyone can take a scan of their body at any given point during a day, right? But we don't really take the time to do that, to check in. But that really is what feeling the feelings is about, is just checking in with the sensations of your body. So I love SE for that, because it really does help you to connect and give some language to what's going on in terms of just the sensation, not, well, I'm feeling this because of, and let me give you a laundry list of reasons why I'm feeling it. Out
like
of
going
the story.
Yes. And sometimes we need a little bit of the story, right? Like we need a little bit of that, but then it's really then just to access the body and to be able to build this capacity to be with what's here. And again, for my Buddhist studies, it's like this helps to support then a sense of equilibrium, or a sense of equanimity, this sense of like, oh, this can be here and this can be here too. And so again, that building of the capacity comes back to that, to be with the discomfort as well as to be with what else is here.
Yeah. And you're talking to approaching all of it with the sense of curiosity, like, oh, isn't this interesting that this is coming up? And oh, I'm noticing this. And so much of the time, and this is, I know, one of my biggest lessons in this lifetime, but it's about judgment. Like we judge what comes up, like, oh, I'm feeling this uncomfortable sensation. It shouldn't be here. that's judgment at the simplest level. And we think of judgment as like being mean or but judgment in its simplest form is just like non-acceptance of what is, right? We're just judging that something is there that shouldn't be there. And it's so much easier to move through the emotions from this place of inclusivity, like you're talking about. But I feel like that's where we all have our various degrees of resistance, because something comes up, it doesn't feel good. And instead of getting curious about it, we want to push it down, push it away, and be like, this shouldn't be here. We judge it.
Totally. And to get to the curiosity, it starts with that coming home to self, an embodied presence of that mindfulness, and then applying compassion and like, ooh, this is here right now. Let me just kind of be with that for a second. Then literally we have access to the other parts of our brain. I call it like an inclusive brain. Like Dan Siegel does a beautiful hand model of the brain and talks about how we can flip our lid when we're stressed out. We don't have access to our frontal cortex. Like I'm putting my hand on my forehead right now, that place of higher reasoning. I call it a connected or integrated brain. Like we want to have that integrated brain so that we can get curious rather than going down the habitual judgment path and all those things. So yeah.
And I can't help but think about joy as a derivative of some of these things, right? And do you feel like joy is something that has to be cultivated, that has to be worked for? Or do you feel like it's something that we embody? It just has to be accessed or uncovered in some sort of way?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really interesting question. So I'm going to answer it this way. It's like what I've learned through somatic experiencing, that the nervous system knows how to heal. And so I have to do very little. I just have to support the conditions that's the art of somatic experiencing and being with someone, supporting the conditions for the nervous system to do what it knows it needs to do. It knows how to come into regulation. So similarly, I think our systems, our spiritual bodies, our physical bodies, even our minds know joy. It's just creating the conditions or a little bit so that and maybe even a little bit of practice so that then we can access it. Yeah. But I think it's always here and we always know it. Like, it's like, oh, like there's a homecoming there almost. Like, again, maybe it's going back to when we were little or that of before born and when we die, like there's this sense of like oneness. And so it's touching into that. So I think it's sometimes just rather than like, oh, I got to develop this or work on it. It's just directing our attention in a particular way. And then our spirit and body and also minds can access it and know it already.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like when it comes to joy, I always feel like that is more fortified within me as a result of experiencing some sort of struggle or challenge. And I don't think it has to be that way, but I think this is where contrast can be so helpful because, right, it allows us to really connect in with the difference between the different sensations or emotions. And so I'm curious, because so much of what you talk about is about joy and delight and play and I'm curious, are there challenges that you've experienced that you feel like have especially fortified, moving you in that direction of delight and joy?
So many challenges. So I think I even started out in utero with something, and that was brought into this lifetime in a challenge, quote unquote, that had to work with and be with and move through and ultimately have an and too with it. There was a lot of tragedy that happened even before I was born. And while my mom was pregnant with me, she was young, she was like 22. Her mom, so my grandmother, was diagnosed with cancer and then died of cancer while I was in utero. So I couldn't put language around this until much later, of course. But I think that I was literally bathing in grief. Like I was developed in grief. And my mom says, "Oh my goodness, Lisa, you were like this." I was born in January. It was in Iowa. And so those really bleak winters. And 6 months later, after my grandmother had died, she's like, "You were like this hope. You were this light that came or just your presence offered so much light." And before that too, like just a couple years before. My dad is the oldest of 7 children at the time. His youngest brother was hit by a car, who was 4 at the time, and died in my dad's arms. And so there was so much grief that was still moving through my parents. And so I say that when you ask about challenge, that I almost put it in quotes because it's so not a challenge anymore, but I can look back and see how there were struggles within me of working with grief. And so, yeah, I really played with that. I'm even using that language, and struggled with this sense of grief in my life, this heightened awareness of our mortality. My dad, I don't remember this moment, but my dad remembers it when I was in middle school, and we were at a soccer tournament in North Carolina. My dad had taken me down and played traveling soccer, and we were getting dressed and stuff. And, my dad was probably all in his 40s, early 40s. And he was putting a shirt on, and I was like, I saw that he was starting to have gray hair, and I was like, and I started bawling. Apparently, I can't remember this. I was like, Dad, you're going to die soon, and he's like, really, we'll be okay. I can't remember what he said. He said, but I remember that moment, or, my dad telling me that moment. I sort of remember it, but, so that was with me, and I had to weave it into my being, or it's weaved into my being. And I had to play with how grief was, informed so much of things. And so that is why I think the depths to which I have felt grief, and there and a lot of other things. Middle school sucked. We moved to Ohio for 2 years, and I was bullied in all these different ways. And it's just, I was hit over the head with a baseball bat this kid hit me over the head with a baseball bat. Oh my gosh. There were a lot of things that happened when I was young, and out of those, and those moments of being excluded, those moments of being hurt and surprised, and also deep grief, has come this deep delight then too, alongside it, and this capacity for that. So yeah, those challenges again from the get-go. And now I see that as even, I don't even know if I call it a challenge anymore. It's like it allowed for then this delight to be here, deep, deep access to delight. So yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's interesting because when you started, you were like, I didn't have these huge, challenges or this, but I think what you're speaking to, I'm not minimizing the challenges you have had, because we all have these challenges, right? And they are deeply important to our journey. And so I want to validate that, and validate for others as well, that, because I hear that a lot, where we're back to that judgment, right? Of where people judge maybe why they are experiencing things the way they are. I know I do it. And when we minimize our experiences, which is incredibly invalidating to ourselves. And I think that's what you're speaking to so much throughout this podcast, is really having the compassion for ourselves, no matter what experience we're having. And to your point, right, you're speaking of this developmental trauma where you came into this life with trauma from, that absolutely imprints in the womb. There's absolutely no question about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. The science supports it. Spirituality supports it, right? It's a real thing. And yet I think sometimes we struggle with why do I feel the way that I feel? I can't put my finger on, I didn't have a horrible childhood, or I haven't really been through it. Why do I feel this void, or this emptiness, or this depression, or this anxiety? And yet it's, I think, in large part because we have so disconnected from ourselves. And the whole theme of our conversation is really coming back to yourself, coming back to home, right?
In this present moment, because so if we even just looked at this from the lens of psychology, things that happen in utero to about 6, 7, when that we have access to, or we can remember things, basically, right? We have that explicit remember, we can remember things. Well, there's all this implicit memory stuff that's happened. And those are those foundational times of our development. And so we know that, for example, in utero, the amygdala is online. The amygdala is like the smoke detector in our brain. And it's a lot. It's online. And so it's gonna, if I smell smoke, it's going to be fire kind of thing. It knows that. And so that's why we often say we can remember, quote unquote, our birth because it's in our implicit, our memory, our amygdala recorded it. So when people say like, oh, this 2-year-old's not going to remember this, they won't remember it explicitly, but they will remember it through their body. So now that's not even to then enter into the world of what we brought into this spiritually, how we're connected epigenetically, how we are connected ancestrally, and all the collective consciousness. So we could be, when we wonder the why and we don't have a reason for the why that makes sense to our adult brain, it could be early stuff in this lifetime, or it could be other lifetimes. It could be something we're bringing in up from our ancestors that wants to move through us and be healed because we're in this space and time when that's available to us now and available to your lineage. It could be from the collective consciousness that we are a part of and we kind of brought into this embodied life. So when people come to me and don't know the why, I'm like, well, let's hang on to the why a little bit. Let's see how that's showing up right now in your body in this present moment. So it always comes back to this present moment. And let's work with what is showing up. So there's anxiety. Okay. So we don't know the source of it. Okay. We can still, quote unquote, work with that. We can still play with that because it's how it's showing up in the body right now. And then going from there. But yeah. And this is all the work you do too. So yeah.
No, it's so good though. And I can, as we're having this piece of the conversation, I'm flashing to any of my listeners who are currently pregnant with babies in utero, who are now maybe freaking out that some experience that they're having is causing harm to their baby. So what would you say to that?
Yes. Okay. Good idea. So I would say it's so many things being a mom myself. Okay. Couple of things. Let me organize this. One is your kiddo, this is my belief, like said yes to being here on this planet in some way, shape or form, said yes to source that I want this experience. And so I know right now being pregnant, you and baby are super connected in one right now, as it should be. And also, they are their own little being. Now, I know that doesn't offer a ton of comfort. So let me give you a few more things. So I'm just planting that seed. Second thing is we are so resilient. I mean, if my story, I can offer anything of like growing into grief. I am super close to my mom. She is a loving human being, and spirit will guide us and guide you and your child how you need to be guided. And so just putting that out there. And we are super resilient. Even not looking at this from a spiritual perspective, which it's almost impossible for me not to, but there is resiliency built into our nervous systems, our way of being. So you do not have to get everything right at all. There's a whole science of good enough parenting. And let me tell you, now having 2 teens, honestly, I totally ascribe to it. I see the science behind it. Good enough. And then the third thing I'd say, so if you want to do something, oh my goodness, prioritize your well-being and self-care and connect to baby just by placing your hands on your belly and your heart and talking to them and telling them how you're human and you mess up and all the things. Just talk to them with all the parts that you are and letting them see your humanness. So I hope that offers some comfort.
I think that's great. It's so real. And also I love that exercise of placing your hands on your belly, even if you're not carrying a child, and just speaking to your inner child in that same way. Right? Because I think sometimes moms have a leg up because they're used to speaking with their children, parenting their children, and communicating those encouraging, nurturing words. And yet when it comes to extending that same communication and conversation to ourselves, to our own inner children, we don't do it. But parents especially have a leg up because you're already doing it with your human children, and we can just flip that around and apply it to ourselves. So I love that exercise in particular, whether you're pregnant or not, and just allowing yourself that self-support, really.
Even my daughter the other day, she's a teen. She's 13. And she said to a friend who was really down on themselves, and I didn't hear that part, but I heard my daughter say over FaceTime, she's like, look, talk to yourself like you would a best friend. Would you talk to your best friend that way? And I couldn't hear her friend or whatever. She must have had her little headphones in or something. And she said, and she's like, no, you wouldn't. And so why would you talk to yourself that way? Like she said, you're the only one who's going to be with you for your whole life. So she's like, so you better start to be friends with you. And then she said it. And last thing was, she said, well, so if you ask yourself, am I going to be worried about this, or is this going to be a big deal in 5 years? And if the answer is no, then you give it no more than 5 minutes.
Wise words.
I know, right? So I was like, it was one of those moments too, a proud mom and therapist moment was like, okay, you got to take those so you can get them. So, but that sense of, so even if we're not a parent, would we want our sister, brother, friend, colleague to talk to themselves that way? And so like a best friend, and we can access it that way then too.
That's so good. Such sage advice. Thank you for all of that. And as we wrap up here, I always love to finish up with one question, which is, how do you see magic and miracles playing out in your life?
Well, I'm going to go back to this. Magic and miracles in my life right now are those little moments, those micro joys, those micro delights where I soften into the experience through my senses. And it could be for 10 seconds, 30 seconds. And then alongside that, I drop into trusting the divine. And how that might show up right now too and what I need that guidance with is I'm writing a third book. And I had to, this is very Capricorn of me, but I had to put down some like a blueprint for how I was going to go about this. And I was like, I am going to go about this in a way that if I'm talking about delight, if I'm talking about ease, then I'm going to embody this in the writing process. So I'm not going to push. I'm not going to push through. I'm not going to like those kinds of things. And so in writing this book, the magic and the miracle that is coming up is that source spirit and my guides like, okay, we're with you then, girl. And when I'm struggling with something and I don't push through, I let go. And so that's kind of how magic and miracles with those little moments of delight and play are showing up through this book. And then I guess the last thing is I'm super big on adventures right now. My kiddos are 13 and 16, and in 2 weeks, we're going to Colorado to go ski for spring break, and just allowing myself to not work and to take off time and go on adventures, little everyday adventures, and then adventures just out like on trips and things like that. But little adventures, even like, ooh, yeah, let's me and my friend try that new coffee shop. That's a little adventure. And then an adventure of like, oh, what's it like to not sit and try to figure out the title or the subtitle of this book, but just to, nope, I'm going to go and go to the Y. I'm going to walk outside, or I'm going to cook something delicious. And so the miracle really is in the surrender and the letting go right now, and the alignment, staying in alignment and staying with that delight.
Thank you so much. And I feel like I want to just reflect to people because they can't see, we're on video, obviously, so they can't see us. But one of the things that I notice so much about you is how you stay in your heart in these conversations. So people wouldn't be able to see that, you take a very conscious breath before you respond. You close your eyes, you put your hand on your heart, and I can tell that you're feeling into the core of your being as you're communicating. And it's such a beautiful thing to witness. So I just want to reflect that back to you, because it's a message for me around like what it looks like to be in your heart and communicating from this very authentic place. So I want other people to benefit from the fact that they can't really see you doing it, but I know they will feel it in your words.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. So this has been such a great conversation. I am so excited for people to hear all of these nuggets. You have such amazing gifts to offer. So how can my listeners support you?
Oh, thank you for asking that. So you can find me at lisamccrohan.com, and that's then where everything is. I have a podcast I started about almost a year ago called Delightful. You could tune in and listen to that. It's sharing poetry and these experiences of delight and how to follow what delights our heart and lead a life that that we deeply love and to hear those soothing experiences. I also have 2 books, Gems of Delight and Your Light is Rising. Again, really in the same heart-centeredness as you've been hearing today. So those are some ways just to reach out to me in that way. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we'll put all of that in the show notes for people. So Lisa, thank you so much again. I'm so grateful for all of the wisdom you're sharing today.
I'm really grateful to be here with you. So thank you, Lindsay. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to the Guided Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I would be so grateful if you would share it with a friend or even leave me a review so we can ensure that it makes its way into the ears of listeners who need to hear these messages most. Until next time, may you remember how guided you truly are.